She buried her husband under a wishing well in her backyard. But the real wish wasn't for love. It was for his pension and life insurance. A quiet yard, an ordinary garden, a simple structure built of stone, and beneath it, the body of a man who trusted her, a man who thought he would live out his retirement years in peace. Instead, his final resting place was hidden beneath the place where neighbors once tossed coins and whispered wishes. This was no accident. This was no misunderstanding. Jimmy Don Beets, a Dallas firefighter, vanished without warning, and for years the truth remained covered by soil, concrete, and lies. But the wishing well wasn't the only secret buried on that property. Another man's remains lay hidden there too, proof that this story was far larger, far colder than anyone imagined. It wasn't just one husband. There were more. Patterns stretched back through marriages, through money, through violence and control. Every layer peeled away revealed a darker chapter until finally the name Betty Lou Beets became known across the country. A missing husband, a yard hiding the evidence, a courtroom packed with jurors who could hardly believe what they were hearing, and finally a walk to death row. Stay with me because the way this story ends is unlike any other case in American history. Betty Lou Beets, born Betty Lou Donovan on March 12, 1937 in Roxborough, North Carolina, was partially deaf due to measles as a child, and later said she was sexually abused by her father. Her mother's institutionalization, when Betty was just 12, left her caring for her younger siblings. These early traumas marked the woman she would become. By age 15, she entered a first marriage. Over the years, that union gave way to 5 more marriages, some of them violent. She shot her second husband, attempted to run over her third, and her fourth husband vanished without a trace. All this set the stage for what would become her most notorious crime. The events unfolded in eastern Texas in the early 1980s, near Gun Barrel City in cedar-laced Cedar Creek Lake. At the time, Texas remained rugged, wide open, and its small communities often shielded dark truths behind unassuming fronts. Her fifth husband, Jimmy Don Beets, was a retired Dallas firefighter. A man of routine, loyalty, and expectations of a quiet retirement, he carried not just a pension, but the promise of life insurance that would sustain his family. On August 6, 1983, Jimmy Don was reported missing from their home near Cedar Creek Lake. His fishing boat, found adrift later, carried only fishing gear, a life jacket, and his heart medication. Nothing that suggested foul play. At first, the community, once convinced this was nothing more than a tragic fishing accident, shifted from sympathy to suspicion. Concern turned to disbelief when, nearly 2 years later, Jimmy Don's remains were discovered buried under a wishing well in his own front yard. The family was torn apart. Children who once saw their mother as a protector now faced grave conflicts of loyalty. And the town that once rallied around Betty Lou, mourned and puzzled, now watched as her deception unraveled. The quiet neighborhood became the stage for a courtroom drama. Before we dive deeper into what happened, what motivated this act, how it was concealed, and how justice unfolded, make sure to subscribe. Because stories like this remind us that truth really is stranger than fiction. She grew into a life shaped by hardship and loss, frailty hidden beneath a facade of survival. Betty Lou Beets was born Betty Lou Donovan on March 12, 1937, in Roxborough, North Carolina. At around age 3, a severe bout of measles robbed her of much of her hearing, impairing her ability to learn and speak clearly. By age 5, she recalled enduring sexual abuse at the hands of her father, a trauma she would later recount in court and private memoirs. When Betty was 12, her mother was institutionalized, and Betty, barely a child herself, became responsible for caring for her younger siblings. She never completed more than a 7th grade education. Betty married for the first time at just 15 to Robert Franklin Branson. They had 6 children before separating in 1969. According to her, this marriage was marked by abuse. Her second husband, Billy York Lane, became violent, reportedly breaking her nose. In 1970, she shot him twice in the back. Charges were dropped when Lane admitted to threatening her life. They briefly remarried but divorced again soon after. Her third marriage was to Ronnie C. Threlcold in 1978. A year later, she tried to run him over with her car. In 1979, she married her fourth husband, Doyle Wayne Barker. He vanished shortly thereafter, only for his remains to be discovered years later buried under a shed on her property. All these marriages were brief and fraught with turmoil, betrayals, violence, and abrupt endings defined her relationships. By the early 1980s, Betty Lou Beets was living near Gun Barrel City, Texas, a quiet rural community by Cedar Creek Lake. Despite her history, she maintained an image of normalcy, a cashier and waitress, a mother immersed in small-town rhythms, raising her children. That outward calm belied a life scarred by trauma and desperate choices, trauma that shaped her decisions in ways outsiders couldn't immediately see. But when husband number 5 entered her life, Jimmy Don Beets, a retired Dallas firefighter with a pension and life insurance, Betty saw more than companionship. She saw a retirement plan. Tonight, we follow the unraveling of a betrayal buried beneath everyday life. It begins with Jimmy Don Beets, a retired Dallas firefighter, a man with a steady rhythm of life and a hard-earned pension. He married Betty Lou Beets around 1982, hopeful for peaceful years ahead. Jimmy Don was known as a devoted public servant. He'd spent years in the Dallas Fire Department, earning respect, a pension, and life insurance, all intended to provide for his future. His family and community believed he was stepping into a well-deserved retirement. On the evening of August 6, 1983, Betty called police to report her husband missing, claiming he had gone fishing and never returned. The lake's still surface offered no answers. Investigators found Jimmy Don's truck abandoned near Cedar Creek Lake, and within days discovered his boat drifting at Redwood Marina, laden with his life jacket, fishing gear, and heart medication. All pointed to a tragic accident. Yet his body was nowhere to be found. The community, shaken and hopeful, joined search efforts, dragging the lake in grim silence. Betty filled the role of grieving widow with seamless precision, tearful interviews, entries in her husband's name on missing person boards. She was the image of sorrow. The town's pain only deepened their confusion, but behind closed doors, she was acting out of a different script. In truth, 2 bullets had pierced Jimmy Don's body, shots fired in betrayal, and his remains were concealed beneath her own front yard, wishing well a garden ornament turned a dark secret. The scandal didn't end there. Under the storage shed in the backyard, investigators discovered another husband, Doyle Wayne Barker, also shot and buried. He was her 4th husband, gone without public suspicion until the soil gave up its secrets. What investigators found in Betty's yard years later would horrify even seasoned detectives. Years seemed to soften time, but they couldn't bury the truth. It was one of Betty Lou's own children, Robert Robbie Branson II, who first stepped forward. He told investigators that on the night of August 5, 1983, his mother said she intended to kill her husband and instructed him to leave the house. When Robbie returned 2 hours later, he found Jimmy Don Beets lifeless and helped conceal the body beneath the front yard, wishing well. His sister, Shirley Stegner, also came forward. She revealed her mother had confided in her about planning Doyle Wayne Barker's death and had asked for help burying him in 1981. Armed with this testimony, police obtained a search warrant and excavated the yard. Beneath that decorative wishing well lay Jimmy Don's remains. In the backyard under a shed lay Doyle Wayne Barker, shot and buried in hiding. Forensic analysis confirmed both men were killed with the same .38 caliber handgun, linking both deaths conclusively. Prosecutors painted Betty Lou as a calculating predator, a so-called Black Widow who murdered for remuneration benefits from Jimmy Don's $100,000 life insurance and his $1,200 a month pension, plus his estate. They introduced evidence of her attempts to secure those benefits soon after his disappearance. Rumors of arson surfaced when Jimmy Don's home, originally his separate property, burned down more than a year after his disappearance. The insurance company suspected foul play and denied the claim. Betty Lou pleaded not guilty, claiming self-defense, a battered spouse pushed to her limits by years of domestic abuse. Her lawyers argued the prosecution had not proven premeditation. But the prosecution's case carried heavy weight. Her son admitted helping cover up Jimmy Don's death. Her daughter admitted helping hide Doyle's remains. Her pattern of abusive, failed marriages and financial motives framed the narrative. In court, Robbie and Shirley testified under oath. Their words were devastating, played out like a tragic script. Mothers don't lead sons and daughters into crime unless something far more chilling is at play. On October 11th, 1985, the jury found Betty Lou Beets guilty of capital murder for causing her husband's death for remuneration. A separate sentencing hearing followed, and she was sentenced to death. Defenders later raised serious concerns. Her lawyer, E. Ray Andrews, held the exclusive media and book rights to her story, a conflict of interest that may have compromised her defense. He did not present evidence about her claims of abuse or his role in pursuing benefits, nor did he testify himself. Despite appeals and challenges, including claims of ineffective counsel and procedural missteps, the conviction and death sentence stood firm. The case ignited national attention. She was dubbed the Black Widow across tabloids and courtrooms in equal measure. Opinion was sharply divided. Some perceived her as a daring schemer. Others felt justice had been compromised by sensational media and a flawed defense. If you were sitting on that jury, would you believe Betty's claim of self-defense or see it as cold-blooded murder? The verdict was delivered, the sentence handed down. But for Betty Lou Beets, the final chapter stretched out over nearly 15 years before closing in Texas's notorious death chamber. In 1985, Betty Lou Beets was found guilty of capital murder, specifically for killing her husband, Jimmy Don Beets, for remuneration, driven by the lure of his pension and life insurance. Just days later, she was sentenced to death. Over the next decade and a half, her legal team pursued appeals and clemency petitions. Yet one central argument remained missing at her trial: her history of childhood and spousal abuse, which might have supported a defense of battered woman syndrome. Courts repeatedly rejected attempts to revisit that omission. Public opinion remained sharply divided. Supporters of clemency emphasized her traumatic background, pointing to years of violence and manipulation. Critics dismissively framed her as a calculated predator, the Black Widow, who murdered for financial gain. The battle between compassion and retribution played out in media headlines and legal briefs alike. On the evening of February 24, 2000, at 6:18 p.m. Central Standard Time, Betty Lou Beets was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She was 62 years old, the second woman executed in Texas since the Civil War, and the fourth woman executed nationwide since capital punishment was reinstated in 1976. She declined a last-meal request and made no final statement as she lay restrained on the gurney. She also chose not to face the victim's family, making no eye contact, though she offered a faint smile to her attorney and spiritual advisor. There were no family members present at her execution. As the injection was administered, she coughed, gasped twice, and then silence. She was pronounced dead. Following the execution, her body was cremated. Her ashes were scattered over her mother's grave. But even at the moment of death, some insisted she was more victim than villain. The story of Betty Lou Beets is more than a tale of murder and money. It is a portrait of cycles of abuse, of survival, and ultimately of deadly ambition. From a childhood marked by trauma to marriages scarred by violence, every chapter in her life seemed to inch closer toward tragedy. By the time her fifth husband vanished, the line between victim and predator had blurred beyond recognition. Her case left behind questions that still echo today. Did the state see a woman shaped by suffering, pushed beyond breaking? Or did it see only the cold calculation of a killer who turned husbands into paychecks? Was execution the right punishment, or did it erase the context of a battered life that could never be repaired? The broader theme is as unsettling as the crimes themselves: the fragile boundary between victimhood and predation. How much of who we become is written by what we endured? And at what point does survival transform into something far more destructive? The trial, the appeals, the final walk to the death chamber, each step became part of a larger debate about justice, mercy, and the way society remembers women who kill. Some crimes end with justice, others end with silence. This one ended with a wishing well full of secrets.